Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The sea stretched endlessly, dark as ink beneath a sky devoid of stars. No moonlight broke the vast, empty night, and the waves moved with slow, oily undulations, as if reluctant to stir. They reflected the barest hint of silver from a distant horizon, whispering secrets to the wind that howled above them. Rising from the restless water like the broken spine of a forgotten beast stood a solitary island, jagged cliffs battered into cruel edges by centuries of ceaseless tides. No name marked this place on any map. No ship veered close by choice, for to the sailors who had glimpsed it, the island was cursed, a wound in the ocean where storms gathered without warning, where mist coiled like a living thing. The few who spoke of it in hushed tones described a towering fortress blackened by age, looming against the night like the last breath of a dying world. But the island was not empty. Beneath its ancient stones, in corridors that had never known the warmth of sunlight, something moved. Something old, something hungry. A wind howled through the ruined spires of the fortress, slipping through broken iron gates and rattling the chains that hung forgotten. Within, at the heart of the forgotten stronghold, a single flame burned, a weak candle flickering atop a table strewn with brittle parchment and ancient tomes. The chamber was vast, yet the walls pressed close, the weight of the stone suffocating, as if eager to crush what lurked within. And seated in the half-light, robes draped like shadows around a figure as still as the grave, was the last inhabitant of the forsaken isle. He did not blink. He did not stir. He sat motionless in the dark, the candlelight carving deep hollows into his gaunt, angular face. He had once been a man, long ago, before the years stretched too far, before the things he had done twisted him beyond recognition. Now he was something else, a being held together not by breath, but by the pull of something deeper, something darker. His lips curled into the ghost of a smile. The candle trembled. A sound echoed through the chamber, a low, drawn-out sigh, not his own. He did not startle, merely turned his head, slow and deliberate, toward the far corner where the darkness was thickest. There, the shadows did not merely gather, they pulsed, moved, breathed. It had taken years to reach this moment. Years of whispers. Years of peeling away the fragile layers of existence until he had touched something else. And now, it was waking. "Come forward," he murmured, his voice dry as withered leaves. The shadows trembled. They hesitated. He smiled. "You are not bound by light or by flesh," he continued, voice coaxing, almost gentle. "You are beyond them. You are what was always meant to be. A breath, a rasping, shuddering inhale, It moved. The shadows did not shift like a figure stepping into view. They did not part as a man might rise from his seat. They did not bend to the rules of form or gravity or sense. They simply unfolded. A shape wove itself from the darkness, tall and slender, impossibly thin. Its outline blurred, as if the air around it had frozen. It was faceless, for it did not need a face. It did not need eyes to see. It did not need hands to take. The candlelight did not reach it. The man inhaled slowly, reverently. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes." It did not speak. It had no tongue for words, but it was listening. He could feel it pressing against the edges of thought, the way cold presses into bone, the way hunger gnaws at the belly. "You were waiting," he continued, his voice soft, soothing, as one might calm a trembling beast. "You have always been waiting." The shape did not move, but the cold deepened. The candle's flame withered, flickering against a force beyond mere wind. "You feel it, don't you?" he whispered. "The weight of them, the heat of their lives, the light pressing down, choking, suffocating. A tremor, a pulse, a slow curling tendril of darkness slithering through the air. You hate it." The shape quivered, as though something unseen had tightened around it. And then, for the first time, it took a step forward. The candle went out. The chamber plunged into utter blackness, but the man did not flinch. He did not need to see. He could feel it, the presence unlike anything else, a weightless void, an absence of warmth, an absence of time. The very breath in his lungs stilled, as though the air had turned to ice. And in that moment, he knew. It was awake. A thrill of triumph coursed through him, electric, wild. He had done what no wizard before him had dared. He had reached beyond the veil of death, not to conquer it, not to evade it, but to harness it, to shape it, to mold it into something terrible, something perfect. "You are mine," he murmured. The darkness coiled, and then, for the first time, it fed. A scream tore through the fortress walls, high and keening, a sound that did not belong to the world of the living. It rattled through the stone, down into the bones of the island, out across the endless black sea where no ships sailed, where no birds dared fly. And as it faded, swallowed by the cold, the darkness thickened. The first had come. The first had fed. Silence followed, vast and endless, as if sound itself had withered beneath the weight of something unknowable. In that silence, the man did not move, did not blink, did not even breathe. He simply sat, his thin fingers resting lightly upon the arm of his chair, his lips curved in the faintest whisper of a smile. He had waited for this moment, had imagined it in every detail. How the first of them would take shape, how it would pull itself from the abyss with the slow inevitability of a shadow lengthening at dusk. But reality, as it often did, had surpassed imagination. This was not merely a construct of magic, not a creature of bone and sinew, nor even spirit. No, this was something deeper, something that should not have been given form, something that had lingered at the edges of existence since the first light burned away the void. He had reached into the darkness and drawn forth its hunger, shaped it, called it into being not with spells, not with force, but with understanding. It was not a beast to be tamed, not a servant to be ordered. It was a hunger that had finally been given a mouth, a longing that had been given hands. He let the silence stretch between them, let the chamber settle, let the thing before him acclimate to the shape it had taken. There was no need to rush, no need to command. This moment belonged to it as much as to him. It had fed, and in doing so, it had tasted existence. That was enough. Finally, he exhaled a slow, measured sound, like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. You felt it, didn't you? No answer, not in words, not in thought, but it moved just slightly, just enough that the air around it thinned, just enough that the cold deepened, just enough that the very stones seemed to groan beneath the pressure of its presence. It had no face, no expression, no eyes to meet his own, yet he could feel it watching him. If watching was even the right word, it was aware of him now, aware in a way it had not been before, in a way that went beyond the physical. He had given it more than shape. He had given it awareness. It is different from hunger, isn't it? He murmured, tilting his head slightly, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood of his chair. The only sound in the suffocating dark. Hunger is simple. Hunger is of the flesh, a thing that comes and goes, a need that can be satisfied and then forgotten. He paused, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to the faintest whisper. But this is not hunger, is it? The shape did not move. This is something else entirely. This is absence. This is the void pressing against the walls of the world. This is what it means to devour, not to consume, but to erase. Still no answer. Only that same stillness, that same shifting, curling presence pressing against the edges of reality. Testing, tasting. You were nothing before this, he continued, voice almost thoughtful now, almost curious. You were the echo of something that had never spoken. You were the breath that never filled lungs, the shadow cast by no light. And yet, here you are. He exhaled again, softer this time, his smile deepening. You know what you are. The thing shifted again, more deliberate this time, as if considering his words, as if rolling them over itself, like mist, moving over a frozen lake. It was a strange sensation, this knowing without sight, this communication that was neither spoken nor thought, merely understood. It was not a creature of logic, not a thing have reason. It was instinct, pure and raw. And yet it was learning. You have no name, he mused, his gaze lingering on the formless dark where it stood. Though it did not truly stand, for it had no limbs, no feet to root it to the earth. No name, no past, no memory. You are only what you are, what you have always been, what you will always be. A single tap of his finger against the wooden surface of the table. The sound like a distant heartbeat. There will be others, he said, his voice calm, assured. Stillness. Do you know that? A pause. The silence grew heavier. Others like you. This world is filled with suffering, with despair, with the slow unraveling of hope. And where there is despair, his voice turned almost reverent, his lips curling into something not quite a smile, you will feed. Where there is fear, you will grow. The darkness pulsed. So it did understand. His breath hitched, not in fear, never in fear, but in something close to exhilaration. It understood, not in words, not in thought, but in the way it moved, in the way it deepened the cold, in the way it pulled at the edges of the air itself. It knew what it was, and it would only grow. He let out a quiet chuckle, leaning back into his chair, fingers lacing together as he regarded the thing he had made. You do not fear me, he observed. That is good. You will never need to fear anything. A pause, not even death, because death is meaningless to you, isn't it? The weight of the thought settled into the thick air, curling through the darkness like a whisper through an open grave. You are not bound to life, he continued, letting the words come slow, letting them seep into the space between them. Not shackled to the fragile strings of mortality. You are the unraveling of those strings, the quiet undoing of existence itself. The thing did not move, but it did not need to. He closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, feeling the cold press against his skin, feeling the weight of what he had done settle into the marrow of his bones. It was not regret. He was beyond regret. It was something else. Satisfaction. Deep, slow-burning satisfaction. Like fire smoldering beneath the surface of the earth. When he opened his eyes again, the darkness had deepened. The air was thinner. The candle had long since gone cold. He had done it. He had called forth the first of them, and soon the world would know them all. Beyond the fortress walls, the sea stirred, restless and knowing, its waves dragging against the jagged cliffs like a beast clawing at the bars of its cage. The wind moaned through the broken corridors, slipping through stone that had known only silence for centuries. But here, within the heart of the island, the quiet had thickened into something heavier, something watchful. The man did not move. He sat with the patience of one who had already won, his fingers idly tracing the grooves in the wooden armrest of his chair, his gaze never leaving the dark. The thing before him did not breathe, did not shift, did not pulse with any rhythm of life. And yet, it was aware. "You do not yet know what you are," he murmured, the words soft, coaxing. "But you will." A ripple in the air, a slow contraction of the cold, pulling inward, a reaction. It understood, not as men understood, not in thoughts, nor in speech, but in the way hunger knows the absence of food. The man exhaled, slow and measured. "You seek." Another shift. "You reach," he continued, tilting his head slightly, his voice almost amused, almost affectionate. "Though you do not yet know what it is you seek to grasp." A long silence. "But that is the nature of what you are." The darkness deepened. "You are longing," he whispered. "The need, the hunger." He leaned forward, elbows resting against his knees, his breath curling in the frozen air. "You are the thing that waits beneath the surface of all things, the shadow cast by every moment of despair. You are the truth that all men fear, but do not name." The shape quivered. "You do not know what it is to be whole," he continued, stepping forward, his movements slow, deliberate, his gaze steady. "Because you have never been whole. You do not know the comfort of warmth, the pleasure of touch, the solace of companionship." His voice turned almost wistful. "You do not know laughter, nor sorrow, nor love, nor grief." A pause. "But you know loss." The air in the chamber tightened, the cold thickening around him, wrapping like unseen fingers curling at the edges of his robes. "Does it frighten you?" he asked, a thread of dark amusement in his voice. The knowing, the understanding that you will never be anything but what you are, that you will never change, never evolve, never grow into something more. He let the words linger, letting them coil through the silence like smoke curling through the rafters of a long-abandoned house. The thing did not move, and yet it heard. "No," he said softly, answering his own question. "You do not fear it." His lips curled slightly. "Because you cannot fear." Another step. "You do not yet know the shape of your own hunger," he murmured, the words barely more than a breath. "But you will." He stopped just at the edge of the thing's presence. "You will understand what it is to take." The air thinned. "You will come to know the taste of a soul unraveling beneath your touch." The cold deepened. "You will learn to savor it, to relish the moment of its breaking." The darkness curled, coiled, pulsed. "And when you do," he whispered, "you will never stop." Silence, utter, endless silence. The shape before him did not move, but it was no longer still. Its presence had begun to press outward, stretching into the chamber, expanding like an unseen tide. He smiled. "You do not need a name," he murmured. You are the absence of all things. The thing pulsed again, deeper, slower, more deliberate. You are the hollow place where warmth goes to die. The darkness shuddered. You are the shroud that wraps around the dying. The cold became suffocating. You are despair itself. A pause, a silence heavier than silence. And then the darkness stilled, settled, understood, and the world, though it did not yet know why, began to tremble. The storm outside had quieted, but the silence it left behind was worse. It was not peace. It was not stillness. It was the kind of quiet that filled a room after something had been taken from it. The kind of hush that followed the last breath of a dying man. The waves no longer crashed against the cliffs in rage. Instead, they churned, slow and ceaseless, as though they too had been caught in the pull of something unseen. The sky hung low, black and heavy, without a single star to pierce its depths. The world beyond this island did not yet understand what had been done here. But soon it would. The man stood now, the weight of his own body feeling distant, unimportant. The thing before him had begun to settle into itself, to shift in ways that were not movement, to listen in ways that did not require ears. It was learning, shaping itself, understanding the space it occupied. It did not hunger for food or drink or even life as men understood it. It was something far older, far more inevitable. It was the unraveling of all things. You do not fear, the man murmured, stepping closer. That is good. His voice was quiet, barely more than breath. But here, in the suffocating dark, even a whisper carried weight. You will never need to fear anything. A pause, not even death. Another pulse. A slow contraction of the cold, an invisible shudder rippling outward through the stone. He felt it now, felt how it tested the air, how it stretched itself thin, feeling for the edges of its existence. He smiled. You do not fight, he continued. You do not struggle. The shadows trembled. That is what makes you perfect. A shift, so subtle it could barely be called movement. But it was there. He could feel the way the air pulled inward, the way the weight of the thing before him pressed against the fabric of the world, bending it, thinning it. Men resist, he said. They claw at time, at life, at the things they know are fleeting. They build, they protect. They fight to hold on to what will always be taken from them. A pause, a breath. But you, he whispered, you do not fight. You do not build. You do not need. The air grew thinner. You are hunger, he murmured. But not the kind that fades when it is sated. Not the kind that is momentary, that is relieved. A stillness settled over the chamber, a waiting silence, thick and final. You are a hunger that does not end, a deepening, a tightening of the cold, as though the very walls were folding inward, as though the stone itself was leaning closer to hear his words. You are the abyss that does not call, but waits. The thing did not move. It did not need to. It was listening. You do not chase, the man whispered. You do not hunt, you simply are. A tremor, so faint it might have been imagined. And the world, he continued, will come to you. The dark pulsed. He let out a slow breath, stepping back now, the weight of his own creation settling around him. The chamber was no longer just stone and ruin, no longer just the remnants of a forgotten fortress. It had become something else, something aware, something alive. They will not know how to fight you, he murmured. Because how do you fight something that does not live? The cold curled at his fingertips. How do you strike against something that feels nothing? The darkness shivered. They will not understand you. He exhaled, the sound soft, almost regretful. And so they will fall. Another shift. Another pulse of cold. Another ripple through the air, as though the thing before him had tightened its grip on something unseen. They will not fall as men fall in battle, he murmured. Not broken by sword or spell. He smiled. No, they will fall from within. The weight of the words settled into the silence. They will break before they ever touch you. The cold stretched. They will despair. A pause, and that despair will be their undoing. The thing did not move, but he knew, without seeing, without hearing, without feeling. It understood, and soon the world would too. The silence in the chamber had thickened, pressing against the stone walls like a living thing. The cold had become something more than a mere absence of warmth. It was not the chill of winter, nor the bite of ice. It was something deeper, something vast and endless. A cold that did not merely touch the skin, but reached inside, threading through marrow and thought alike. The man breathed it in, let it settle into his bones, let it fill the spaces where lesser men might have carried fear. You are not pain, he murmured, watching the thing as it pulsed in the darkness, shifting at the edges of sight, a presence without form. Pain is fleeting. Pain is endured. Pain is survived. A slow breath, a knowing smile. Know what you are. What you will be is far worse. A flicker in the dark. Something just beyond the reach of comprehension. You are despair itself. The words curled into the void like ink spilled into water, spreading, sinking deep. The final breaking of the spirit. Another pulse, a pull in the air, subtle yet undeniable. The moment when all light is gone, and nothing remains but the endless dark. The silence between them stretched, thick as iron, unshakable. He let the words settle, let them weigh upon the space they occupied, let them sink into the thing before him like a whisper slipping into the fabric of the world. And then, you will not need to take their lives. The darkness quivered. you will take something far greater, a slow curl of cold pressed outward, unseen fingers tightening around the chamber. You will take what they cannot live without. A pause, a breath. You will take themselves. The thing did not move, but it did not need to. The understanding had already begun. You are not like them, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, a thread of thought woven through the thick air. You will never be like them. You will never be anything but what you are. The cold deepened. You will never know love. The shadows thickened. You will never know warmth. The darkness pressed closer. You will never know the comfort of a memory, untouched by sorrow. A stillness settled over the chamber, heavier than the weight of the sea outside, heavier than the sky that stretched black above the island. You are the darkness that clings to the edges of their waking minds. The walls of the fortress groaned. You are the shadow that waits at the corners of their dreams. The air trembled. You are despair. Silence. And then the cold exhaled. The man stepped back, his work not yet finished, but nearing its inevitable conclusion. He had spent his life searching for this, unraveling the fragile lies that held the world together, peeling away the illusions that kept men from seeing the truth. And now, here, in the heart of this forsaken place, he had done what no wizard before him had dared. He had created something that could not be stopped. You are the first, he murmured, his voice carrying through the dark like the last echo of a dying prayer. A pause, a breath, but you will not be the last. The storm outside had begun to shift, the wind howling once more, lashing against the cliffs, against the broken towers, against the empty halls of the fortress. And beyond the island, beyond the endless stretch of blackened sea, beyond the world that still slept in ignorance, something unseen had begun to stir. Something was coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. The fortress had ceased to be just a place of stone and ruin. It had become something else, something vast and unyielding, something that carried the weight of what had been born within it. The walls, once broken by time and storm, now stood in a silence so complete that it pressed against the skin like a presence of its own. No warmth lingered here. No sound carried through its halls. Even the echoes had fled, swallowed by the darkness that pulsed in the chamber's depths. The man stood at its center, watching the thing he had created as it began to take shape, not in body, not in form, but in purpose. It did not move, not in the way that living things moved. It did not breathe, did not shift, did not exist in the way men understood existence. But it was aware. It had begun to understand the world in a way that only hunger could. You do not yet know what you will become, he murmured, stepping forward, the cold curling around his skin like mist. But you will learn, a ripple in the dark, A pull in the air, faint but deliberate. You will learn what it means to be feared. Another shift. A slow, curling motion, unseen but undeniable. You will learn what it means to take. A deepening of the silence. A weight settling over the space between them. You will learn what it means to erase. The presence before him did not respond in words, nor in thought. It had no need for such things, but it listened, and it knew. "You are not death," he said, his voice quieter now, reverent, as though speaking to something sacred. "Death is an ending. Death is mercy. Death is peace." A pause, a breath. "But you," his lips curled, "you are worse." The walls seemed to lean in, the very stone pressing closer, as if drawn by the gravity of the thing before him. "You are what lingers after death." The fortress groaned, the weight of the air stretching thin. You are the absence that remains when everything else is gone. The cold tightened, coiling inward. You are what they fear most, not the pain, not the suffering, but what comes after. A tremor in the silence, a whisper in the dark. You are the thing that waits in the spaces between moments, in the shadows beneath their beds, in the quiet that follows a final breath. Another pulse, another shift, another tightening of the air. You are despair, and the thing, the presence, the wound in the fabric of existence itself. Understood, a flicker in the dark, a movement that was not movement, a reaching that required no hands. You will not need to chase them, the man continued, his voice softer now, filled with something like certainty, something like triumph. They will come to you. The air shuddered. They will run, but they will not escape. The cold curled. They will fight, but they will not win. The darkness pulsed. They will fall, not because you strike them down, not because you break their bones or spill their blood, but because you take something they do not know how to live without. Silence, and then slowly the chamber exhaled. The man smiled. "You do not need a name," he murmured, stepping back, the satisfaction settling deep in his bones. "You are not meant for such things." The wind outside howled, battering against the fortress walls, as if the world itself was rebelling against what had been done here. But it was too late. The first had awakened, and soon the others would follow. Beyond the fortress walls, the sea churned, sluggish and heavy, its black waves stretching into infinity. The storm had not passed, nor had it raged. It had simply become, settling into something that no longer needed violence to be feared. The sky remained empty, a void above a void, a vast expanse of nothing where stars had never belonged. The world had not yet realized what had been set into motion, but the air had changed, the weight of it, the pull of it. The first ripple had already begun. Inside the chamber, the man stood in the center of the darkness, watching the thing that was no longer just a shadow, no longer just an idea. It had no eyes, but he felt its attention. It had no form, but he felt its presence, pressing against the edges of reality itself. The chamber had grown colder, the silence thickened, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was something worse, something filled. "You feel it now, don't you?" he murmured, his voice a whisper woven into the heavy air. The ache that will never be satisfied, a flicker in the dark, the hunger that has no end, the cold pulled tighter, the knowing that you were never meant to be whole. The walls pressed in, though they did not move. The weight of what had been created here had settled into the very marrow of the fortress, stretching through its stones like roots, digging into the earth. "You will never change," he continued, his tone thoughtful, almost gentle. "You will never grow. You will never be anything more than what you are now." A slow pause, but you will spread, a pulse in the air, slow and deliberate. You will not seek them out. Another shift, curling inward. They will come to you. The thing did not move, but something had awakened within it, something old, something inevitable. It did not hunger for flesh, did not thirst for blood. It was not a creature of violence. It was something far worse. "You will take nothing from them," the man whispered, stepping forward, his breath curling in the frozen air. "And yet, they will be empty." The darkness tightened. "You will not strike them down." The air thinned. "You will simply," he exhaled, slow and careful, "exist." The fortress groaned beneath the weight of something that had no weight, something that was felt not in the body, but in the soul. "You are not a shadow," he murmured. "Shadows require light." A slow curl of cold, slipping through the chamber. "You are not death. Death is final." A pull in the air, stretching outward. "You are what remains after everything else is gone." Silence. "You are despair." And with those words, something in the world, far beyond this island, far beyond this chamber, began to break. The man stepped back, his gaze steady, his breath slow, his pulse untroubled. He had always known this moment would come. He had imagined it 1,000 times. And yet, the reality of it, the sheer weight of it, pressed into him with a satisfaction he had never known before. "You are the first," he murmured, "but not the last." Outside, beyond the sea, beyond the sky, beyond the world that still believed itself untouched, something unseen had begun to stir. The pull of it, the spread of it, the quiet unraveling of what had once been whole. The world would not understand. Not yet, but it would. It would. The wind howled across the fortress, slipping through the crumbling stone like a whisper long forgotten. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs, its waves slow and deliberate, as if drawn toward something unseen. The night was thick with silence, but it was not an absence of sound. It was the presence of something greater, something vast and inescapable. The world did not yet know it, but the change had already begun. Inside the chamber, the man stood in the center of it all, unmoving, unblinking, watching the thing he had created. It was no longer merely a shadow, no longer merely an idea. It was here, it was awake, and it was waiting. "You do not need a purpose," he murmured, his voice barely more than breath. "You are what you were always meant to be, a ripple in the dark, a tightening of the air. You do not need to be told what you will do." The cold pressed inward, curling around his ribs like unseen fingers. "There is only one thing you will ever be." A long, slow pause. "You are the end." The darkness pulsed, slow and deliberate, as if testing the weight of the words. "You are death without dying," the man whispered. The unraveling without touch. The silence deepened. "You are the void left in their hearts, the emptiness that cannot be filled." A flicker in the air, a pull, a shift. "You are Azkaban." The fortress itself seemed to exhale, the walls groaning beneath the weight of the truth. "You will call them," he continued, his voice almost reverent. "Those who have lost themselves, those who have nothing left, they will come to you, drawn by the hunger they cannot name." The thing did not move, but the air had changed. "You will feed them." The silence stretched, vast and knowing. "You will sustain them." A slow pulse, the cold curling outward, reaching. "You will multiply." Beyond the walls of the fortress, beyond the blackened sea, beyond the world that still slept in ignorance. The first ripple of something unseen spread outward. A whisper carried on the wind, a shift in the balance of things. The man stepped back, his work complete, his creation before him. He had done what no wizard before him had dared. He had reached beyond the veil of death, not to conquer it, not to escape it, but to shape it, to mold it into something perfect. And now the world would know. The first had been born, but it would not be the last. Far beyond the island, far beyond the empty sky, far beyond the reach of those who still dreamed in warmth, the others would come. The world, whether it was ready or not, whether it fought or surrendered, whether it denied or believed, would learn. Azkaban had been born, and it would never die.